Plot twist: Russia's military is being eaten alive by its own corruption. They were supposed to attack at dawn. Instead, a Russian unit barricaded the battalion office and demanded their pay. The commander swore there was an ammo shortage. The soldiers knew better. The depot had rounds, just none for them unless the fee was paid. Phones out, voices shaking, they recorded a mutiny built on missing salaries, stolen fuel, and fake paperwork. The unseen enemy wasn't across the line. It was inside their own ranks. We're going to follow how that rot took root, from Soviet habits to 1990s chaos, procurement scams, and a war in Ukraine that turned lies into casualties. The blueprint of rot, late Soviet decay. To understand why the wheels came off, we have to go back to the system that built them. In the late Soviet years, the defense economy ran on quotas. Factories didn't chase performance, they chased numbers that satisfied plans. Success meant meeting targets on paper, not delivering gear that worked in the field. If you met your quota, you were safe. If you told the truth about failures, you were a problem. Managers learned a simple rule: it's better to fake success than report reality. That's how ghost production became normal. A plant could claim it produced 100 guidance units even if 50 lacked critical metallurgy or bearings. The boxes moved, the stamps hit the forms, the bonuses flowed. On paper, the missile brigades were fully equipped. In practice, maintenance crews spent nights cannibalizing 2 broken parts to keep a third limping along. Paperwork replaced performance. And the longer it went on, the more dangerous honesty became. Meanwhile, the Komsomol and party networks wove themselves through the defense sector. If you wanted copper wire or precision machine time, you didn't file a request. You called a comrade who owed you a favor. Promotions weren't just about engineering skill. They were about reliability to the party line and ability to resolve shortages through informal channels. Patronage lubricated the machine. It also taught people that rules were obstacles, not guides. Afghanistan should have been the wake-up call. Units struggled with mountain logistics, helicopter readiness, and night fighting. Reports from the field documented equipment failures and poor training feedback loops, but the system filtered bad news. Readiness reports were massaged to please superiors who measured success by outputs, not outcomes. A brigade commander who admitted his BMPs were down for lack of spares risked his career. The one who claimed 92% readiness and staged a smooth inspection was rewarded. Lessons that should have driven reform got buried under self-preservation. Here's a micro-story that captures the culture. A factory chief ran a line producing vehicle transmissions. The plant lacked a shipment of hardened steel rings. Without them, the transmissions would fail after a few hundred kilometers. He had 2 options: halt production and report the shortfall, or keep the line running with substandard rings and hope the failures surfaced elsewhere. He chose a third path. He traded a stash of spare parts, meant for warranty repairs, to a friendly manager in another city who could acquire the proper rings off the books. As payment, he promised a slot for the man's nephew in a vocational school attached to the plant. The line met its quota. The paperwork looked clean. The warranty pipeline quietly dried up. Soldiers, years later, would pay for that solution on a dirt road far from the plant. These weren't isolated incidents. They were survival strategies. In a command economy, your career lived or died on your ability to produce good numbers and avoid making superiors look bad. Over time, the habits hardened into institutions. Inspectors expected to be hosted, staged, and satisfied. Warehouse chiefs knew inventories were fictional but matched to forms. Engineers learned that an elegant fix mattered less than a timely signature. The incentive was to hide the problem, not solve it. One detail would matter later: the split between what the system believed about itself and what workers and officers knew to be true. A ministry report could assert that a certain tank model had been upgraded fleet-wide. Factory logs could show only partial completion. Units might receive the upgrade kits, check the boxes, and lack the tools or manpower to install them. Everyone played along because the alternative, admitting shortfalls, threatened budgets and careers. The truth lived in quiet conversations and whispered complaints, not in official channels. Meanwhile, the defense plants functioned as social ecosystems. They provided housing, clinics, summer camps. Plant directors became barons who balanced party expectations with local needs. They paid wages late, but maintained patronage networks through side deals. When a shipment went missing, a director could lean on a Komsomol contact to procure a replacement through a regional enterprise whose books never matched its output. Solving problems this way turned corruption from a vice into a tool. You didn't survive by saying no. You survived by making the numbers work however you could. Afghan veterans returned with stories that hinted at systemic rot. Radios that failed, boots that fell apart, vehicles with thin armor overlays that cracked. Their after-action reports were filtered into vague directives about improving quality control, then buried under new 5-year plans. When the Soviet military shifted toward more complex systems in the 1980s, missiles with smarter seekers, vehicles requiring better maintenance, the gap between paperwork readiness and real readiness widened. Complexity punished fakery, but the bureaucracy rewarded it anyway. By the late 1980s, shortages and delays rippled through the defense industrial complex. Plants hoarded components, which created artificial scarcities that could be leveraged for favors. Workers pilfered small items, bearings, copper scrap, even gloves, to barter for food or services. A captain trying to keep his unit's vehicles running might drive to a plant to beg for parts, bringing cartons of cigarettes or a promised commendation letter to grease the exchange. The uniformed and civilian worlds learned to survive together by bending rules until they broke. What nobody knew at the time was how resilient these behaviors would be after the collapse. You'd think the end of the Soviet system would end the lies. Instead, it released them into open markets. When central controls fell away, the old networks adapted overnight. The habit of treating the rules as negotiable didn't disappear. It found new prices. The stakes of this period weren't abstract. Every time a manager faked output, a soldier inherited gear more likely to fail in the field. Every time a readiness report was polished, a commander planned an operation on false assumptions. Every time a factory chief swapped spare parts for favors, maintenance pipelines dried up farther down the chain. Corruption wasn't a side effect. It was a survival mechanism that rewired the military's nervous system. And because truth-tellers had been punished for decades, the bench of reformers was thin. Younger officers learned from seniors who taught them that the art of command included protecting the unit from the system by gaming it. A smart lieutenant didn't escalate problems. He solved them off the books. A savvy quartermaster didn't report losses. He found creative accounting. Initiative meant finding workarounds that didn't embarrass superiors. That mindset would outlast the flag over the Kremlin. The collapse didn't end it. It set it free. When the state retreated, the informal network stepped forward, turning habits into business models. The factory chief who traded spare parts for favors would soon trade entire production lines for cash. The officer who greased a plant manager with cigarettes would soon negotiate fuel deliveries with men carrying pistols. The gap between paper armies and real armies was about to widen into a chasm. Shock therapy, shadow empires, 1990s privatization. The collapse came fast. The adaptation was instant. Defense assets didn't drift into the private sector. They were hauled out the gates. Plants that once answered to ministries woke up answering to men with briefcases and guards who didn't wear uniforms. Auctions set market prices for machine tools and test stands nobody outside the industry could properly value. Whole workshops went for pennies to front companies, then reappeared under new names with the same managers, only now they took a cut. Inside the barracks, money evaporated. Pay was late for months. Rations turned into IOUs. Units survived on barter, diesel for potatoes, spare tires for meat. Commanders moonlighted, driving taxis at night, selling scrap metal from base perimeters, renting out storage space to traders. Officers who held the line watched their families sink into poverty. Others learned a faster way. Sell access, sell fuel, sell anything that could move. A truck that was in repair could quietly do 3 trips for a commercial client before sunrise. This was the era of non-cash payments. Factories paid suppliers in refrigerators, not rubles. A depot chief needed brake pads. He took 15 boxes of canned meat from the rations warehouse and swapped them at a market run by men with new suits and old scars. The accounting matched because everyone agreed the numbers matched. Meanwhile, soldiers ate buckwheat without the meat that balanced the books. On paper, nothing was missing. On the ground, everything was. Mafia protection blended with procurement overnight. If you wanted a contract fulfilled, you didn't just sign it. You paid for security to ensure parts got from A to B without vanishing. At railheads, loads were revalued by middlemen who decided which items reached their destination intact. That's where the shadow empires grew, logistics corridors carved up by local strongmen, each taking a toll. The state still printed stamps, the streets printed authority. At the top, the consolidation of arms exports under Rossaborougsport was sold as order. In practice, it put a gate on every deal. Fewer sellers, bigger intermediaries, more room to skim. Large contracts kept the headline industry alive, but they also hid a pricing game where inflated costs flowed into offshores and kickbacks. A plant that survived on export orders learned the lesson. Pleasing the broker mattered more than pleasing the end user. Cash for rank became a poisoned normal. Promotions that once depended on exam scores and command evaluations now traveled with envelopes. A battalion commander who bought his post owed debts. He paid them by selling platoon leader slots, leave passes, even softer postings. Trust fractured in the chain of command. Subordinates looked at their leaders and saw transactions, not mentors. When orders came, soldiers weighed them against the suspicion that someone else was getting paid. Chechnya exposed every scene. Troops deployed with shoddy kit, boots that split, body armor with empty plate pockets, radios that picked up music more reliably than commands. Fuel disappeared between depot and frontline under the phrase, everyone learned to hate, lost in transit. Drivers sold loads under pressure or for survival. Brigades planned operations on maps that didn't reflect reality because reporting reality would admit theft. Logistics didn't just fail, it was preyed on. Here's where the institutional memory hardened. A captain who kept his unit moving in Chechnya didn't do it by filing forms. He knew a tire yard owner who could find a set overnight, and he paid in tank diesel siphoned with a rubber hose. That captain later taught juniors how to make things happen. Don't wait, don't ask, don't write, trade. What began as wartime workaround became peacetime doctrine. Back in the plants, privatization split enterprises into shells. Parent companies held contracts, subsidiaries held liabilities. Quality control officers who once signed off on tolerances now argued with accountants about component substitutions. When a foreign customer demanded a certain alloy, the accountant suggested a cheaper mix for this lot only. Workers watched skilled colleagues leave for shuttle trading or construction abroad. Those who stayed learned the new goal: keep the line running and keep the owner happy. Arms trafficking sat in the seams. Excess stock from collapsing depots fed black markets across borders. Some officers looked the other way, some took a cut, some disappeared after asking questions. The bureaucracy that once smothered theft was too weak to stop it and too complicit to admit it. The incentive to lie, born in the Soviet era, found lucrative oxygen in the 1990s. Meanwhile, non-cash deals gutted Readiness. A plant received a load of timber instead of money and paid wages in that timber. Workers sold it at a discount for quick cash. Delays rippled, components arrived late, deadlines slipped. Defense ministries extended grace periods because there was no alternative. Penalties for failure were negotiable. What wasn't negotiable was the quiet tax every middleman took for making anything move. The culture of inspections morphed into theater with new props. Instead of hosting party officials, base commanders hosted investors and regional bosses. They staged live-fire demos with borrowed ammo and rented generators because the base's own inventory was in arrears. Grass got painted, fences got mended, a visiting entourage declared revival. When the convoy left, the paint peeled, the generators were collected, and the armory returned to scarcity. There's a micro-story from this period that says more than a report. A motor rifle regiment's quartermaster discovered that half the diesel for an upcoming rotation had already been allocated to a local trucking cooperative owned by the district's deputy head. He protested, got a visit, and was told he could either sign the release and receive assistance, procuring food for his troops, or he could file a complaint and see his rotation cancelled for readiness issues. He signed. The regiment moved. The logs showed fuel consumed as planned. The men ate well that month. The price was simple. The lie became policy. By the late decade, oligarchs had stitched regional supply chains into private empires. Defense plants that resisted were squeezed with debt, then rescued in exchange for shares. Boards filled with loyalists who understood that the new oversight wasn't about performance, it was about control. Auditors signed off on numbers that led nowhere. Real oversight, testing, field feedback, life cycle maintenance, shrunk to a line item a manager could massage. All of this produced a pyramid. At the bottom, conscripts paid bribes to avoid the draft or to secure safer postings. In the middle, officers paid for promotions and recouped costs by renting out state assets. At the top, brokers took percentages off contracts that kept the facade upright. Everyone downstream knew the game and adjusted. If you wanted radio batteries, you stole them early, before the warehouse got reconciled. If you wanted body armor, you called a veterans charity or bought from a market stall. The myth is that a strongman ended the chaos with order. The reality is that the chaos taught the system how to function without rules and how to profit from that freedom. When a leader finally promised stability, the people who'd mastered shadow empires didn't disappear. They lined up to formalize their fiefdoms under the banner of state revival. The habits from the 1990s weren't a detour, they were the road. And they were about to feed a new vertical that traded loyalty for access and called it reform. Putin's vertical, loyalty over capability. Then came the promise of order. The men who'd mastered the 1990s understood the offer immediately. Pledge loyalty upward, receive access downward. That's the power vertical, less a reform than a hierarchy of favors. The Kremlin centralized levers, the clans around it carved fiefdoms. Siloviki groups, security chiefs, connected businessmen, regional bosses didn't just jockey for influence. They turned ministries, plants, and logistics corridors into territories where loyalty was currency and oversight a nuisance. Defense budgets swelled. Oil money and ambition funded grand rearmament plans, sleek presentations, and glossy brochures. The number that mattered wasn't a unit's readiness, it was the headline allocation. With more money came thicker secrecy. State secrets, labels expanded, audits narrowed, and public tenders became formalities. Where the 1990s had chaos, the 2000s perfected controlled opacity. If you wanted to see how rubles became rifles, you needed permission from the people who profited from the murk. Within that fog, clans split the pie. One group took aviation, another nurtured armor, another controlled electronics. Competing designs didn't fight on performance, they competed on proximity. A weaker product with a stronger patron beat a better product with a weaker one. The message filtered down to factory floors, hit the milestones that secure the next tranche, not the quality that wins a war. Missed tests could be reinterpreted. Failed trials could be rescheduled. Everything bent to preserve the narrative that the Renaissance was on schedule. Then came a man who tried to break the pyramid, partially. Defense Minister Anatoly Serdyukov slashed paper divisions, pushed professionalization, and cut sacred cows. Some cuts were real, some savings were theater. He forced consolidation of procurement and began buying foreign kit, drones, vehicles, even talk of Mistral ships, to pressure domestic producers. The reforms hit entrenched networks hard. They retaliated by opening new graft lanes inside the change. Restructured units kept ghost positions, outsourced services became extraction points, and savings reappeared as consulting fees and inflated subcontracts. Serdyukov's orbit fell in a corruption scandal. The specifics mattered less than the signal. Reforms that threatened patronage would be punished. In his place came Sergei Shoigu, the consummate manager of appearances. He stabilized relationships with Siloviki clans and built a PR army. Uniforms got new cuts, parades got bigger, exercises got flashier. TV crews filmed precision strikes and airborne drops set to music. Inspections became stagecraft. Commanders received the script, troops rehearsed, and cameras rolled on cue. That's how Potemkin readiness became policy. Units learned which vehicles to park up front, which buildings to repaint, and which officers to keep out of sight. Live fire events were meticulously choreographed. Ammunition expenditures reported to Moscow didn't match the crates on ranges. The difference dissolved into budgets and bonuses. Training calendars showed robust cycles. Soldiers knew they were cleaning barracks for the general's helicopter. The public saw confidence. Insiders saw a gap widening between the image of a modern force and the everyday grind of keeping engines running and radios powered. State corporations locked the gates. Rostec emerged as the grand gatekeeper, bundling enterprises, absorbing rivals, and dictating who built what. Centralization promised efficiency. It delivered monopolies that insulated suppliers from competition. If your plant had the license and the patron, your bid won. If your product faltered, the solution wasn't a competitor's design. It was a supplemental contract and a new deadline. The ecosystem that once bartered in diesel now bartered in exclusivity. Here's a micro-story that captures the tone. A base commander got word of an imminent inspection by a high-ranking visitor. The motor pool was short on serviceable vehicles. The grass outside the barracks looked like a field. He called a contractor to cut and clean. The contractor didn't show. So the commander sent conscripts out with buckets and pigment to paint the grass along the inspection route a richer green. The cameras saw healthy grounds and a neat line of operational vehicles, some towed into place, batteries borrowed across units. The report glowed. The engines coughed to life later, off camera, and died within days. Money poured in. The leaks grew. Big-ticket programs became pipelines. The Armata platform showcased at parades while serial production stalled. The Su-57 flew prototypes while avionics and engines lagged. Air defenses boasted capabilities that outpaced industrial throughput. The point isn't that these systems didn't work at all. It's that the institutional incentives favored announcements over delivery, prototypes over fleets, and political victories over logistical realities. When budgets balloon, a percentage skim at every tier multiplies. A corrupt system prefers long development cycles, plenty of milestones to monetize. Meanwhile, loyalty audits replaced technical audits. Plant directors performed allegiance through televised briefings. Generals performed it through casualty-minimizing reports and optimistic timelines. A procurement chief who pushed back on an underbaked design risked labeling as obstructive. One who smoothed the path for a favored supplier secured his clan's place at the table. The vertical rewarded those who kept narratives intact. The price was a steady erosion of the painful feedback militaries need to learn and adapt. On the ground, contract soldiers appeared on paper faster than in barracks. Wage promises attracted recruits, late payments bled them away. Career NCO development was announced, then underfunded. Units filled gaps with conscripts while briefings spoke of professionalization. Hazing didn't vanish. It moved out of the camera's frame. Drone warfare lessons arrived from Donbass and Syria, but procurement channels treated them as inputs to presentations rather than drivers of doctrine and kit redesign. Innovation from below, garage fixes, field mods, was tolerated only when it made someone up the ladder look good. The Syria campaign became a showroom. Flights were scheduled to impress. Systems were deployed selectively. The operation gave valuable experience to some cadres, but its narrative power at home outstripped its scale. The lesson absorbed by the vertical was dangerous. Manage the picture, and you manage perception. It set expectations for future fights that reality couldn't meet. A limited expedition with hand-picked units and controlled logistics is not a template for a continental war. Secrecy thickened around failure. Accidents were treated as image problems, not diagnostic opportunities. Investigations sought culprits who could absorb blame without threatening patrons. Safety cultures at plants bent to schedule pressure. Quality control officers learned which defects to flag and which to monitor in service. The distance between official defect rates and workshop whispers widened. Workers in welding shops and electronics benches told each other which lots to avoid. Those warnings rarely traveled up. The vertical also reshaped regional power. Governors became mobilizers in waiting, distributing favors to factories, recruiting offices, and volunteer groups. Their loyalty was measured in public displays, open lines with the Defense Ministry, visible support for troops, staged donation drives. Behind the scenes, they negotiated skims on contracts and steered local suppliers into the Rostec orbit. Aid that should have flowed through stable channels instead passed through personal networks. When the stress came, those networks would fray. And the stress did come. The structures built to prioritize loyalty over competence delivered what they were designed to deliver: pleasing reports, stable patronage, and a confident public facade. What they couldn't deliver was in the fine print: spares at scale, training hours that matched claims, logistics that bent without breaking, command chains that tolerated bad news. The power vertical held the system together while quietly starving it of oxygen. Here's the cost in one sentence: a system that punishes truth manufactures surprises. When plans were drawn up, decision-makers believed the numbers their vertical rewarded. The men with grease under their nails and mud on their boots knew better. But they didn't write the briefings. They repainted the grass. And they waited for a reckoning that would arrive on roads crowded with vehicles that looked modern in parades and stalled in the rain. The procurement mirage: how paper armies are built. While that was happening in Moscow's parade plans, another story was being stamped into contracts. Procurement became the art of building a force on paper. The mechanics were simple. You rig the bid. You write the technical specs so narrowly that only one unique supplier can qualify, often a shell company tied to someone's cousin or a retired colonel with the right gate pass. Costs are padded in layers: a subcontract for fasteners, another for specialized connectors, a consultancy to optimize integration. Each slice looks small. Together, they turn a rifle into a luxury good, a radio into a mortgage. Kickbacks lived at every tier. A plant manager nudged an invoice. A ministry evaluator adjusted a score. A colonel signed acceptance for gear he knew would sit in crates. The prize wasn't delivery, it was the next tranche. Meanwhile, unit quartermasters learned the quiet rule: if you want anything to arrive intact, meet the truck early. The last mile wasn't a logistics term, it was a feeding zone. Boxes were opened, a handful lifted, lids retaped, and forms matched to fiction. Look at the flagship programs. The Armata tank rolled through Red Square with a new silhouette and a promise of generational change. Serial production, though, crawled. Suppliers missed tolerances. Optics lagged. Engines demanded a metallurgy base that had been thinned by years of shortcuts. A prototype makes a parade. A fleet requires an ecosystem. The Su-57 told a similar story. Sleek airframes, but engines not ready, avionics packages shuffled, small batch numbers that make sustainment a nightmare. Air defenses like the S-500 were announced as if numbers already filled regiments. Behind the stage, test articles lived in a world of shifting deadlines and classified caveats. The point isn't that these systems were fake. It's that the procurement culture rewarded announcements, and penalties for delay were negotiable. Audits, when they happened, checked compliance with paperwork, not performance against battlefield needs. What nobody saw on the TV feed was the maintenance trail you need for real war. Spare engines, trained techs, diagnostics gear that works in the rain, and depots that can turn around repairs faster than units burn through parts. Those lines on budgets were easy to trim when patrons needed headlines. Protective gear told a harsher truth because it touched bodies. The state bought 6B-45 plates and carriers, then units unboxed vests with empty pockets or plates that failed drop tests. Genuine ceramic was swapped for inferior composites, sometimes Chinese knockoffs with the right stamp. Helmets showed up with liners that split. Gloves tore in a week. A battalion's manifest could show a full issue, while soldiers swapped cash on Telegram for civilian-rated armor that actually stopped fragments. Every stolen ruble converted to a risk borne by a kid in muddy boots. Rations were a barometer. Contract numbers looked fat, field delivery looked thin. Expiry dates crossed from best by into jokes. A crate might contain the right count of meal packs, but someone upstream had swapped components. Meat cans replaced by cheaper spreads, heaters missing, tea bags substituted with stale biscuits. On paper, caloric values hit the mark. On patrol, men learned to count on locals, volunteers, or their own wallets. Radios told the same story. Procurement boasted encrypted sets. Units bought Chinese handhelds because the issued gear either didn't arrive, didn't charge, or couldn't talk through interference. Bid rigging wasn't a glitch, it was the engine. Technical requirements read like they were written by the winning supplier because they often were. A crucial bolt pattern, based on legacy norms, forced buyers back to the same machine shop with the license. If that shop's owner also had shares in a logistics firm, the margin doubled. And since secrecy cloaked most defense tenders, challengers couldn't even prove the fix. Competition died not with a bang, but with a quiet clause about state security. Here's where the paper army gets built in slow motion. A division is allocated new radios. The ministry posts the procurement and receives 3 bids. The favorite wins with a price just below the cap. Subcontractors source batteries from a reseller who sources from a warehouse that has a habit of relabeling old stock. The radios ship. Acceptance teams sign off after a scripted test. The units stash the crates until an exercise, open them, and discover half the charges fail. The paperwork shows success. The exercise report mentions minor issues rectified in the field. The next procurement round funds a battery upgrade. Meanwhile, pricing stacks up across time. When you add integration kits, custom brackets, and training packages, you turn a simple item into a budget line ripe for graft. A truck radio isn't a radio anymore. It's a communications suite with installation costs, maintenance contracts, and a certification course delivered by a company owned by the same people who supplied the bracket. Each piece seems justified. Together, they hollow the unit's ability to field sufficient numbers. One micro-story anchors it. A mechanized brigade received new plate carriers with tags that match the contract. The first firefight turned them into evidence. A medic noticed ceramic shards crumbling like chalk. He shipped 3 plates back through channels with a note. Suspected counterfeit. 2 months later, the plates returned with a letter stating, tested within acceptable limits. The medic kept 1 shard in his pocket as a reminder. He stopped sending notes. He started calling a volunteer group that sourced Western plates. He wasn't building readiness. He was surviving procurement. Counterfeit and substitution spread where oversight thinned. Bearings substituted with cheaper alloys in engine rebuilds shaved thousands of kilometers off service life. Gaskets ordered to spec arrived with tolerances that leaked under winter stress. Tires showed cracking within months because the rubber compound had been stretched with fillers. Each defect was small, manageable in isolation. In aggregate, it meant convoys that stalled, armor that shed tracks, and maintenance crews that burned out trying to keep vehicles moving on cannibalized parts. And the incentives cut one way. A contractor who delivered on time with slightly cheaper components banked a bonus and rarely saw penalties, especially if his patron covered him. A contractor who insisted on higher quality at higher cost invited scrutiny unless he could sell the upgrade politically. So the system rewarded the corner cutters. The honest lost bids. Soldiers paid the difference. Procurement also masked unit theft. A battalion quartermaster might sign for 300 tourniquets. He'd distribute 180 and keep the rest for emergencies, which meant barter for generator fuel or favors from a hospital chief. When war came, families bought tourniquets in stores because the unit had them. The Mirage worked until bullets arrived. This was the moment everything changed. The doctrine on paper assumed kit that matched the catalogs. The battlefield assumed shortcuts. When stress hit, the supply chain cracked exactly where the graft sat, at joints, connectors, consumables, and training. And because the numbers looked good in Moscow, planners kept believing the army they'd funded. The army that showed up was something else. And the supply chain, it was designed to fail under pressure because failure paid. Delays generated urgent orders with premium pricing. Shortages justified emergency waivers that favored friends. Returns fed refurbishers tied to the original sellers. The loop closed neatly. Declare success, deliver less, profit off the fix. Put simply, corruption didn't just bleed the force, it wrote the bill of materials. Logistics as a crime scene. 3 days after that inspection-ready motor pool, a railcar door slid open at a western depot, and the smell hit first. Sweet, chemical, wrong. The manifest listed fresh propellant charges. The crates held shells with swollen casings and propellant bags that had sat in damp storage for years. An officer signed anyway, because rejecting the load would trigger an inquiry that landed on his desk. He logged, received in good order, then told his gunners to separate the worst and pray the rest didn't blow a breach. Depot rot is quiet until it is. Inventories match forms because forms are the reality that matters. Labels get swapped to roll expiry dates forward. Piles of rusting rockets move locations just before audits, then move back. A chief of storage learns which aisles inspectors never reach and stacks the problem there. When a fire breaks out, it's blamed on negligence, not on decades of humidity, leaky roofs, and a maintenance budget shaved to preserve someone's margin. Spare parts live two lives, the one on paper and the one in a motor pool. On paper, maintenance is on schedule. In the yard, crews cannibalize vehicles to keep a handful rolling. A transmission from a non-mission capable truck jumps to a commander's favorite ride the day before a demonstration. After the cameras leave, both sit on blocks. The maintenance software shows green because a clerk learned which fields to tick. The living truth is a line of vehicles that look whole until you open their hoods and count missing belts. Fuel scams are the logistics culture distilled. Diesel moves in numbers, liters, tons, kilometers. Each figure is elastic if your meter is adjustable and your paperwork tidy. A depot meter can be doctored with a hidden valve. It flows slow for state clients and fast for commercial night shifts. Drivers top off with water layers under diesel and sell the difference at roadside lots. Receipts are pristine, signatures line up, and a battalion burns through fuel faster than models predict. Planners blame driver behavior. Quartermasters know the tankers never arrived full. What nobody knew at the time of those parades was how the railheads had aged into choke points with glossy signage and broken reality. A truck fleet sits in a yard with insurance certificates and inspection tags, tires chalked for movement. Keys live in a safe that opens during inspections. The rest of the month, half the fleet is cannibalized. One engine swap feeding 3 vehicles. Mechanics are paid late, so they work weekends for private clients and borrow tools. When a mobilization order hits, the fleet rolls out like an old man standing too fast, dizzy, uncertain, leaning on the healthiest limb. Micro story. A driver, 35, double-hatted as a contractor and a corporal, picks up ammunition from a regional depot for front delivery. Halfway, he pulls into a lot where men wait with cash. He sells a chunk of the load, then calls his dispatcher. Lost in transit. Bad roads, bad straps. He photographs a broken pallet, texts coordinates of a pothole, and files a damage claim. The paperwork shields him. The unit downwind receives enough to stage an exercise, not a fight. On his next run, he brings pastries for the depot guards. Everyone smiles. Everyone loses. Meanwhile, inventories are falsified with a precision that would impress any accountant. Software migrated from Soviet-era ledgers to modern interfaces, but the habit survived. You reconcile by the quarter, massage by the month, and plead data transfer issues when reality intrudes. An audit catches discrepancies. You initiate a write-off for training use retroactively. The shells that cracked in damp storage become expended in night firing. The diesel siphoned in August becomes consumed during emergency generator tests. This is where the stakes cut deep. A battalion tactical group plans a maneuver that assumes 3 days of fuel and 2 resupply cycles. The first day's push stalls at noon. Radios crackle with excuses. Traffic, weather, enemy action. The real reasons sit in invisible margins. 8% short deliveries over months. Tires that shed tread because compounds were stretched. Batteries that won't hold charge because the last lot was refurbished junk. Commanders learn quickly. Don't maneuver far. Don't risk encirclement. Hold ground where your logistics can limp to you. Parallel to the fuel and parts is the quiet death of maintenance culture. In manuals, scheduled inspections are sacred. In practice, they become signatures. Maintenance happens on paper because the men who could do it right were promoted for spreadsheets or left for better pay. Those who remain juggle too many systems with too few spares. They adapt in smart ways, fabricating brackets, swapping compatible parts across models. But the cumulative effect is drift, small deviations that add up to big failures under stress. Rail logistics, once the pride of Russian military movement, became a relay with too many uninterested hands. Civilian rail bosses prioritize commercial contracts that pay, then squeeze military trains into windows that look fine on a calendar and awful on a clock. Depot crews prep loads for 60 departures that leave at midnight. Perishable stores, meds, batteries, certain propellants sit in heat they weren't designed for. Blame lands on technical delays, which is a euphemism for rent-seeking at nodes you can't publicly confront. And when equipment does arrive, last-mile theft turns delivery into suggestion. Warehouse chiefs skim the top line for contingency, a self-funded emergency stash that doubles as a trade cash. A company sergeant signs for 200 shovels and receives 140. He files nothing because filing breeds retaliation. He tells his men to dig with what they have and asks a volunteer group for more. The state posts photos of shipments. The front posts photos of trenches dug with bare hands. In the aftermath of each exposure, a fire at a depot, a convoy found looted, a base starved of fuel, investigations flex toward individuals, not systems. A driver is fined. A warehouse chief is demoted. The meter stays. The contract holder keeps the route. The culture learns the correct lesson: hide better, not fix faster. Corruption adapts like water. It finds cracks, fills them, and looks calm on the surface. While that was happening in depots, forward commanders adjusted doctrine to logistics, not the other way around. They planned fires around what ammo really existed, not what inventories claimed. They rationed maneuver to roads supported by known drivers and honest depot chiefs. They hoarded good tires and batteries like gold. The army that shows up in plans, nimble, combined arms, fueled for tempo, shrinks into a force that advances only as far as its least corrupt link can carry it. Training could cover some gaps, if training were real. But training burns fuel, tires, and ammo. In a system where every liter and round is a potential revenue stream, commanders simulate instead of shoot, idle instead of drive, and clean instead of fix. Then they learn the hard way that simulations don't tow a stalled vehicle out of an ambush. The training illusion, readiness theater. While logistics limped, training put on a show. Snap exercises, those dramatic alerts that sent units unexpectedly to the field, were rehearsed weeks in advance. Commanders got the scenario, the VIP schedule, and the camera angles. Vehicles with working engines were pre-selected, ammo counted for display, and fire missions scripted so nothing jammed on cue. Crews learned to perform competence, crisp salutes, practiced drill, choreographed fire and maneuver. Performance replaced practice, because practice burns fuel and exposes flaws. Ammo budgets disappeared in reports. A brigade could file consumption numbers that matched training plans without ever issuing the rounds. Soldiers fired blanks into berms, then signed forms attesting to live fire lessons. On paper, marksmanship improved quarter over quarter. In the field, recruits learned the rhythm of recall only in their first combat. Range days turned into safety briefings and policing brass. Those who pushed for real firing schedules were told to prioritize readiness for inspection. The heart of any modern army is its NCO corps. Russia's suffered from a gap you can't paper over. Instead of empowered sergeants who trained squads and enforced standards, units leaned on officers stretched thin and conscripts rotating out before they mastered basics. Hazing filled the leadership vacuum, enforcing hierarchy through humiliation rather than competence. Initiative drew suspicion. A corporal who improvised a better breach drill risked a reprimand for deviation, while the platoon that marched prettiest drew the commendation. Contract soldiers existed in presentations more than barracks. Contracts were signed to fill quotas, then attrition hollowed rosters. Some units backfilled with conscripts, masking the swap by blending them into contract formations during inspections. Pay delays bled away experienced troops, and the promise of stable careers dissolved into side gigs. Training cycles designed for professionals met a reality of churn. Instructors taught to the slide deck timetable, not to mastery. Syria became the training syllabus, and a distortion. Selected units rotated through an expeditionary campaign where logistics were controlled, air cover was abundant, and the enemy fought differently than a peer. Footage fed back home highlighted precision strikes and coordinated assaults. Lessons that mattered, deconfliction, small unit autonomy, joint fires, arrived filtered through a PR lens. Units that didn't deploy to Syria trained to emulate the images rather than the gritty routines. Boring maintenance, relentless small arms drills, night movements in bad weather, casualty care under fire. Here's where the theater hurt most. The substitution of certification for competence. Schools issued diplomas to meet targets. A driver passed a course with 10 hours behind the wheel because the syllabus said 10 hours was enough. A mortar team certified on a simulator, then carried tubes they'd never boresighted. Medics learned protocols without tourniquets, practicing with rubber bands because real kits were locked up or missing. The result was brittle readiness, capable of a parade demonstration, fragile under friction. Micro-stories slipped through. A company trained for urban breach with wooden doors recycled each week. On inspection day, they hit the door clean. The next month, they faced a metal gate with welded reinforcements and no breaching charges in the truck. The platoon leader hesitated, not from fear, but from unfamiliarity. Training had produced muscle memory for a prop, not a problem. They tried to ram it. A sniper watched them struggle. Meanwhile, training calendars filled with ceremonial obligations. Drill for commemorations. Rehearsals for visiting delegations. Hours burned cleaning vehicles for flyovers. The opportunity cost was simple. Every afternoon polishing tracks was an afternoon not spent on gunnery tables, map work, or casualty evacuation. Officers learned to manage appearances upward and improvise downward, squeezing real practice into slivers of time that didn't threaten the next inspection. Ammo wasn't the only ghost. Tires, engines, optics, anything that training could wear down became rationed. Commanders ran dry exercises for vehicle crews. Climb in, click through procedures, never start the engine. Tank crews practiced fire commands with empty breeches. Artillery crews rehearsed handoffs without live rounds, then validated with a single shell per gun to satisfy paperwork. The first time a battery fired, a sustained mission was often in combat, with predictable errors in dispersion and timing. The NCO deficit showed in simple tasks that armies live on. Radio discipline collapsed under stress because no one enforced it in training. Map reading devolved into following pre-programmed routes because GPS training was safer and cleaner. Night operations shrank to daylight hours. Range safety culture, meant to prevent accidents, calcified into range avoidance. A mishap could end a career. A simulated success could secure a promotion. The system learned to avoid risk, not master it. Some officers fought the tide. They carved out live fire blocks by bartering with quartermasters, cut ceremonial fluff to squeeze in fieldcraft, and built informal NCO circles to mentor sergeants. They ran under the radar drills, dawn PT with radios, nightland nav with checkpoints, blank fire room clears with strict safety. Results improved. Then a complaint landed from a neighboring unit about noise outside scheduled hours. The officers got a call. Stick to the calendar. Excellence became a paperwork problem. What nobody knew at the time, outside the squads, was how much of the real training migrated to private channels. Junior leaders shared videos of Ukrainian TTPs, drone footage, and casualty care tutorials in chat groups. They bought civilian tourniquets and chest seals. They practiced with airsoft and power tools, shaping door charges with materials they could get. When they took these hacks up the chain, they heard the same line: submit officially. Official channels turned those ideas into proposals that sat, unapproved, until the next inspection. This was the moment everything changed. February 2022 took the illusion and forced it into contact. Convoys rolled with drivers who'd never done long haul under threat. Tankers manned guns they barely live-fired. Junior leaders who'd never been trusted with autonomy found themselves in dead zones with broken comms and had to choose. Units that had drilled scripted assaults met ambushes, mines, and drones. They learned fast, but at a cost training should have paid in peacetime. War rewards reality, not press releases. Squads that had practiced casualty drills with real kits kept men alive. Those that hadn't watched blood pools and fumbled with improvised tourniquets. Batteries that had secretly run live fire packages put rounds on target under counter-battery pressure. Those that hadn't exposed themselves with sloppy setup and slow displacement. The gap between paper readiness and lived competence translated into bodies, captured vehicles, and retreats framed as maneuvers. In the aftermath, the cycle tried to adapt. Units begged for more ammo for training, depots shrugged. Families crowdfunded bandages, ministries posted photos of shipments. Commanders wrote blunt after-action notes. Hire edited them into lessons learned without procurement implications. The theater survived because it protects careers. The men it fails protect each other. Training could have been the cheapest fix. Fuel and rounds spent in peacetime save lives in war. But in a system where corruption taxes every liter and every cartridge, training is an expense with no ceremony attached. So the army rehearsed confidence instead of building it. And when the curtain lifted, the performance met gravity. Ukraine, war as stress test. The plan assumed speed. A decapitation strike on Kiev, airborne seizures of airfields, armored columns racing down highways as local collaborators opened gates. Intelligence moved in stovepipes. Dissenting assessments were filed away. Commanders received sealed envelopes with timelines that required a logistics miracle and a political fantasy. When units crossed the border, reality greeted them with mud, mines, and a million small shortages that had been hidden for years. Convoys stalled not just from ambushes, but from tires that split after a few dozen kilometers. Rubber compounds had been diluted to save costs. Storage had been sloppy. Maintenance was paperwork. Drivers checked tread, not age. Sidewalls cracked, beads separated, and a single blout on a highway could halt an entire column. Crews scrambled with jacks they'd never used, under fire in ditches, on phones to logisticians who said the spares were en route. Those spares often existed only on balance sheets. Fuel vanished. Tankers arrived light, meters doctored, seals replaced, documents in order. Commanders diverted combat vehicles to secure makeshift refuel points, stacking risk on risk. Maps were outdated. Bridges labeled intact had been rebuilt differently or not at all. A supposedly direct route became a maze of unmarked detours where ambushers knew the choke points better than staff planners who had learned to trust the numbers. Radios failed the next test. Issued sets with encryption sat in crates or didn't interface as advertised. Units bought Chinese handhelds on their own, exposed to interception, but at least audible. Electronic warfare units switched on jammers that choked friendly comms. Batteries died faster than training taught because the last procurement round shipped refurbished stock with fresh labels. Officers fell back on cell phones that worked until towers didn't. Orders traveled as screenshots of maps, with emojis marking objectives. Armor rolled with visible improvisations. Cages welded over turrets as anti-drone protection, era bricks strapped on haphazardly. Some bricks were empty, others were counterfeit, their filler replaced by inert material somewhere along a supply chain that paid margins on weight, not function. Crews learned the hard way which lots blew and which lots simply shattered. Reactive armor that should have detonated became decoration. Airborne troops who expected a quick airhead met layered defenses. Helicopters flew into MANPADS arcs because planners assumed surprise would suppress resistance. At Hostomel, a bold seizure turned into a brutal lesson. Logistics can't ride on daring alone. Follow-on forces couldn't secure a reliable corridor. Fuel bottlenecks, air defense fratricide, and confused tasking turned a showpiece into attrition. Meanwhile, the artillery duel exposed another layer of rot. Tubes wore out faster than predicted because charging tables were optimistic and propellant lots were inconsistent. Counter-battery systems lagged. Fire missions took longer to compute as units jury-rigged networks. Forward observers ran drones bought with donations. Batteries that had practiced one round per tube to satisfy training reports had to jump to sustained fire under pressure. dispersion errors bled effectiveness. Ukraine, learning faster, punished static batteries with drones and precise counterfire. Mobilization revealed the gap between announcements and reality. Paper units needed bodies and kit. Families lined up outside surplus stores to buy boots, socks, thermal layers, tourniquets, radios. State-issued gear arrived late or not at all. Volunteers filled the gap, creating parallel supply chains that saved lives and embarrassed officials. Phantom contracts, food, clothing, medicine, collapsed under scrutiny when recruits opened boxes and found rations years expired, uniforms that tore, first aid kits with bandages, and no hemostatics. Microstory. A platoon leader posted a list in a Telegram chat: tourniquets, chest seals, compact dressings, headlamps. He attached a photo: young faces, mismatched vests, Chinese radios clipped to straps. Donations poured in from strangers. 2 weeks later, in a tree line under mortar fire, those tourniquets kept 3 men alive. Later, the unit's official medical supply finally arrived: gauze rolls, iodine, and a commendation for exemplary self-sufficiency. Intelligence failures weren't just misreads. They were shaped by a culture that punished bad news. Analysts who warned of stronger resistance saw their memos buried. Factional politics at the top narrowed the circle. The invasion's secrecy meant logistics officers weren't looped in early enough to stage rail cars, preposition spares, or coordinate with civilian rail for priority paths. The first week's delays weren't random. They were the compounded interest of years of inflated readiness and hollowed depots. As the offensive bogged down, commanders adapted within the constraints corruption created. They shortened supply lines by shifting to positional warfare in sectors where rails and decent roads still functioned. They rationed fuel to units likely to hold ground. They learned to avoid ambitious envelopment that required trust in depots and drivers they didn't have. Initiative shrank because the system punished risk that exposed shortages. Drones changed the math. Cheap quadcopters stripped away the fog of war and the fog of lies. A logistics park that looked fine on paper became a pattern of trucks that never moved. A battery that displaced hourly was seen sitting in the same tree line for days. Soldiers recorded empty plate carriers, fake-era misfit boots. Those videos bypassed official channels and landed in public view. The theater met an audience that responded in real time, and it wasn't impressed. The ammo shortage narrative appeared and reappeared, sometimes real, sometimes a cover for theft, mismanagement, or punitive rationing in clan feuds. Units complained of rationed shells, while warehouses miles away held stock, reserved for favored formations or simply uncounted. Field commanders gambled: go public and risk charges for discrediting the army, or stay quiet and watch opportunities slip as artillery duels turned on who could sustain fire. When rotations hit, the maintenance deficit bit harder. Vehicles cycled to rear areas found depots without parts or techs, because mobilization had stripped plants and shops of skilled labor. Engines queued on stands waiting for bearings that Sanctions had pushed into black markets, where prices soared and quality plunged. Cannibalization deepened, turning fleets into patchwork that mechanics held together with ingenuity and wire. The speed of repair couldn't match the pace of attrition. Sanctions should have forced cleanup. Instead, they added friction that corrupt networks monetized. Microelectronics were sourced through cutouts. Civilian chips went into missiles. Some worked, some failed under stress. Bearings came from parallel imports with forged certificates. Steel quality varied lot to lot. The result wasn't collapse, it was unpredictability. A system that already lied to itself about reliability now faced supply chains that lied to everyone. Amid all this, pockets of competence stood out. Units with hard-nosed commanders, trusted NCOs, and access to volunteer networks adapted faster. They standardized civilian drones, codified trench raid TTPs, ran casualty drills until hands moved without thought. They still bled, but less. Their reports, when they landed on desks, were sometimes ignored because their fixes threatened someone's margin or demanded doctrinal humility. Innovation from below stayed local, shared laterally in chats more than vertically in orders. Wagner's emergence and mutiny underscored the Mafia logic the war had laid bare. Their frontline performance in places rested on brutal discipline, simple logistics, and a peril outside the ministry's clogged pipelines. Their revolt cited ammo rationing and shakedowns, airing grievances regular units whispered. The state responded with negotiated face-saving and selective purges, signals of fear, not reform. For soldiers in trenches, the message was plain. Loyalty is transactional, and money is a weapon. By late phases, the Russian military could still mass fire and grind ground, but at costs higher than planners imagined. Each kilometer came with diesel skimmed somewhere, shells rationed for reasons that didn't make tactical sense, and vehicles that failed on contact because a gasket failed in winter cold. The plan to take a capital in days had turned into an industrial slog, fought by a force that had to relearn humility while its superiors clung to narratives. War exposed a simple truth hidden by decades of theater. You can't bribe physics. Tires either hold, radios either connect, plates either stop fragments, and fuel either reaches engines. Where corruption had been an invisible tax, war made it visible as smoke on highways, as abandoned armor with dry tanks, as medics holding empty pouches. The stress test didn't invent the failures, it illuminated them. And once seen, they couldn't be unseen by the men who had to fight with what the system really was. Following the money, graphed cases and silenced alarm bells. While the front was bleeding, Moscow finally pretended to look inward. After 2022, headlines announced arrests up the procurement chain, deputy ministers, catering moguls, uniform suppliers. On TV, it looked like a reckoning. Inside the barracks, it felt like clan warfare. The cases clustered around contracts everyone already cursed: food, clothing, field rations, construction, and medical supplies. Prosecutors paraded photos of luxury apartments and stacks of cash. Soldiers asked a quiet question. If theft explains empty shelves, why are the shelves still empty after the perp walks? Catering became a symbol because it touched every soldier, every day. Contracts built for scale turned into conduits for theft, with per meal costs padded by middlemen and deliveries shaved at kitchens. Units signed for calories that never reached plates. When investigators moved, they didn't audit entire chains. They targeted a figure whose fall served a faction, then declared victory. In mess halls, the soup still tasted thin. The message landed. Exposure isn't reform, it's redistribution. Uniforms told a similar story. Massive orders for seasonal kits spawned micro-empires of resellers and subcontractors. Some delivered fabric that met spec until the first rain. Boots separated at the sole seam. Gloves split under stress. Arrests followed paper trails to a few visible owners. Their networks reconstituted under new names within months. A colonel's wife opened a charity drive to fill gaps. Volunteers delivered better socks than the state. That contrast hardened cynicism faster than any speech. Field rations were where the rage condensed. Videos of expired packs went viral, date codes scratched, oils rancid, heating elements missing. Investigators seized pallets, cameras rolled. A warehouse clerk took the fall. No one revisited the procurement terms that rewarded the lowest bidder with opaque sourcing and zero-cost overage substitutions. The system punished symptoms because causes implicated patrons. Meanwhile, the Wagner mutiny ripped the curtain on payroll and ammo politics. Their complaint wasn't abstract. It was accounts payable, salary arrears, bonuses withheld, and ammunition rationed in ways that looked less like strategy and more like leverage. They accused the ministry of shakedowns: pay to play, pay to get shells, pay to keep lines moving. Regular units recognized the logic. The state settled the immediate crisis with deals and denials, then rewrote the narrative. But the accusations stuck, supply as extortion. Look closer at how money actually moved. Regional governors discovered war as theater and opportunity. They launched aid drives with glossy streams, quadcopters, camouflage nets, generators. Citizens donated. Procurement offices matched funds. Somewhere between purchase and delivery, skims appeared. A drone listed at market price tripled on an invoice routed through a friendly LLC. Boxes still reached trenches, enough to film gratitude, while margins flowed to local power brokers. Those brokers later posted patriotic threads about sacrifice. Volunteer funds became parallel ministries. They built reputations for speed and honesty. Commanders texted them before calling official channels. That helped units survive and deepened institutional rot. The state pointed to volunteer success as proof of national unity, then quietly leaned on those networks to plug procurement failures. When a governor tried to control the volunteer flow, he didn't do it to improve accountability. He did it to clip rivals' wings. Aid became a stage for fiefdoms to compete. Selective purges came in waves, timed to scandals and infighting. A deputy procurement chief fell after a leak about construction graft at training bases. A logistics general was suspended over fuel contracts that always drew suspicion. Yet program heads with deeper patronage survived, even when their portfolios produced a steady drip of bad outcomes. Inside ministries, staff joked about rotating the lightning rods. Everyone knew what that meant. Take the hit, keep the machine. Whistleblowers tried to force change. An auditor flagged irregularities in a uniform contract, naming shell firms and inflated shipping fees. Her report stalled, then resurfaced edited, conclusions softened. She found herself reassigned to analytics support, far from tenders. A depot officer documented consistent 12% shortfalls against invoices on 3 routes. His superior praised the thoroughness, then warned him about career risks of being too visible. He learned the ancient rule: truth without a patron is a liability. Banks traced odd flows. Compliance teams flagged a pattern. Defense contractors paying consulting fees to offshore entities that optimized logistics. The same offshore paid dividends to relatives of regional officials. When sanctions tightened, the paths grew more tangled. Kyrgyz intermediaries, Armenian importers, Dubai cutouts. The complexity didn't hide quality issues on the battlefield. It did hide accountability. When a missile misfired due to a subpar chip, the money trail ran into fog. One micro-story shows the scale in miniature. A mid-level procurement officer noticed a recurring vendor for medical kits with a different company name each quarter. Same address, same manager, new tax ID. Prices climbed, contents shrank. He drafted a memo recommending disqualification. A senior called him in, smiled, and slid a folder across the desk full of photos of ribbon cuttings, ministers shaking hands with the vendors, consortium. The message wasn't subtle. He signed the renewal. Later, he donated his own money to a medic he knew, buying tourniquets that worked. Law enforcement actions mapped onto clan lines. When a Silovic's business rival expanded into his defense niche, a case appeared. When a governor fell out of favor, auditors found old sins refreshed. The public saw anti-corruption. Insiders saw score settling. Real reform would mean independent audits, transparent tenders, and empowered inspectors with protection. What they got were episodic dramas and a chilling effect on honest dissent. The stakes reached command cohesion. Trust is a combat multiplier. Graft erodes it. If a brigade commander believes his ammunition allocation depends on appeasing a patron, he plans accordingly. More cautious fires, hedged offensives, loyalty performances to secure resupply. Subordinate units, sensing politics, start back channeling for favors. Coordination frays. In staff meetings, officers talk tactics while calculating clan dynamics. The battlefield punishes, but with delays and mismatched plans. Sanctions should have changed the equation. Fewer sources, more scrutiny, a push to clean house. Instead, they raised cut rates along black market chains. Parallel imports introduced new middlemen who demanded their slice. Each workaround created plausible deniability for defects. A bearing fails, blame a foreign supplier. A radio dies, blame counterfeit chips. The root, procurement culture that rewards opacity, stayed intact, now insulated by national security rhetoric. Alarm bells rang from think tanks, veteran groups, even pro-war bloggers who documented gear failures. Some posts triggered quick fixes, others drew prosecutions for discrediting the army. That law became a tool to silence inconvenient facts about missing kit and corrupt contracts, not a shield for operational security. The chilling effect was immediate. Units stopped posting needs publicly, shifting to encrypted channels and trusted intermediaries. The state reclaimed the narrative. It didn't reclaim competence. In the aftermath of each scandal, ministries announced commissions, audits, hotlines. Soldiers who called learned the script, filed details, receive a case number, wait for silence. Contractors adjusted paperwork, rebranded subsidiaries, and resumed. Governors staged another handover. TV found another angle. The machine kept moving because too many people ate from it. Here's the conclusion commanders drew in private. Prosecutions are weather, not climate. The climate is patronage. As long as loyalty outranks performance, money will seek the path of least accountability. And as long as money moves that way, bullets and boots won't move right. Reform isn't optional in war, it's logistics by other means. Without it, every plan costs more blood than it should. Sanctions, substitutions, and black markets. Sanctions should have been a scalpel. They became a market. When high-end components snapped out of reach, the networks that learned to monetize scarcity in the 1990s slipped back into their old clothes. Only now the profits were bigger, the paperwork tighter, and the risks wrapped in flags. The brochure word was import substitution. The street translation was simpler. Find something that looks like the original, swear it's the same, and sell it for more. Microelectronics sat at the center. Missiles and radios don't care about speeches, they care about chips. Export controls cut access to specialized processors and radiation-hardened parts. The workaround didn't wait for ministries. Cutouts in Hong Kong, Dubai, Yerevan and Bishkek started sourcing civilian-grade chips at scale. A missile built for a battlefield got a brain designed for a dishwasher. Some worked. Some cooked under heat or jittered under vibration. Engineers filed notes about failure rates. Managers filed invoices that showed success. Quality control buckled under speed and secrecy. Bearings sourced through parallel imports arrived with certificates in perfect Russian, but metallurgy that told another story under microscope. Gearboxes rebuilt with those bearings ran hot and died early. Alloys substituted to meet quotas cracked in winter. A plant manager raised concerns and got a visit from a regional official who reminded him that delivery schedules were a matter of national security. He stopped writing memos. He started slipping bad lots into the training use column. Parallel imports tripled prices and halved reliability. Each border crossing added a skim, a customs fixer here, a freight forwarder there, a consultancy fee for routing that avoided attention. By the time a component reached a plant floor, its price had bloated beyond any rational ledger. That sticker shock didn't improve the part, it improved the margins. Managers learned a new refrain. Substitution isn't a compromise, it's patriotic. The phrase covered 1,000 sins. Workarounds grew into professions. Import agents became celebrities in industry circles. Men who could promise German quality from the Eurasian Economic Union with a grin and a spreadsheet. Offshores multiplied to catch payments that banks might otherwise freeze. Compliance officers inside those banks learned which files to flag and which to let pass when a call came from someone who could make budgets disappear. The more complicated the route, the cleaner the conscience for everyone paid along it. Industrial fatigue followed. Plants already thin on skilled labor lost more to mobilization and migration. Old hands who could read a lathe by sound were replaced by new hires trained in a week. Schedules stretched to weekends. Safety briefings got shorter. Injuries climbed. When a run failed QA, managers faced a choice: scrap and miss the deadline, or stamp and ship while drafting a plan to monitor in service. The second option fed the machine. The first ended careers. Meanwhile, sanction-proof stories fed TV. Executives cut ribbons on new domestic lines. A factory unveiled a fully localized drone with a flight controller bought on AliExpress through a reseller who also sold gaming parts. A press release claimed resilience. Mechanics in the back shook their heads and soldered another connector onto a board that wasn't meant for freezing rain. This wasn't just about high-tech. Tires, lubricants, sealants, consumables that keep an army moving fell into the same pattern. Synthetic oils replaced with mixes that sheared under load. Sealants that lost elasticity in cold snaps. Winterized fuels cut with cheaper blends that gummed injectors. Each defect had a fix, but the fix cost time, spares, and trust. Commanders learned to treat certain batches like minefields. Avoid if you can, double-check if you can't. Smuggling networks ran like shadow logistics corps. Drivers learned which warehouses in Almaty or Yerevan stocked the good Taiwanese chips and which stocked reals with polished fakes. A procurement officer kept a private spreadsheet of trusted intermediaries, annotated with birthdays and preferred payments. He wasn't building a resilient supply chain. He was building a Rolodex that survived audits because the invoices matched the new legal grey. Where sanctions should have squeezed corruption, they inflated it. Risk premiums became the new skim. A simple component's price rose fivefold under the label restricted. Contractors billed for the hassle with a patriotic flourish and a surcharge. The state paid because the alternative was admitting that production targets were fantasy. That money didn't all go offshore. Some of it bought loyalty, bonuses to keep crews from leaving, hush funds to smooth inevitable defects, and favors to keep regional bosses smiling. Here's a micro-story. A missile plant received a lot of power regulators via Armenia. The datasheets matched, the boards didn't. A line engineer ran stress tests and logged a 17% failure rate at temperature. He escalated. His manager sent the report upstairs with a cover note. Urgent substitution constraints. Recommend acceptance with operational caveats. 2 weeks later, a directive arrived. Proceed. Field reliability to be assessed. The engineer watched the regulators go into systems. 6 months later, he read a summary of an in-flight anomaly and didn't sleep well. Black markets aren't just external. Inside plants, scrap bins became treasure. A worker could pull a handful of connectors, headed for discard, and sell them to a volunteer group desperate for reliable parts. That circular economy, said the quiet part. Volunteers, smugglers, and state factories all swam in the same pool, buying and selling the same components under different labels and moral flags. The lines blurred because survival rewarded anyone who could deliver. Sanctions also reshaped timelines. Extended lead times forced back production that didn't fit maintenance cycles. Units received heaps of one item and nothing of another, hoarding what they could and improvising around what they couldn't get. Planners at the ministry ticked boxes, deliveries fulfilled. Commanders at the front ticked different boxes, vehicles sidelined for lack of a $12 sensor. The narrative of self-reliance hardened. New institutes announced research into domestic microelectronics. Old plants dusted off stale projects and renamed them. Funding flowed, and with it, opportunities. A director pitched a 5-year plan with milestones that paid well before results mattered. Interim products were good enough for training use. Field units learned to translate. Don't bet lives on it. Sanctions did hurt. Complex systems thinned. Aerospace suffered the worst, where long supply chains are unforgiving. But pain didn't automatically produce discipline. It produced arbitrage. The men who understood customs codes and front companies became more valuable than the men who understood tolerances. A colonel looking for stable radios called a broker, not a lab. In the aftermath, the machine ran on fear as much as fuel. Managers feared missing quotas more than delivering defects. Officers feared admitting failures more than fighting with brittle kit. Procurement chiefs feared exposure more than waste. The system kept moving because it's built to move, even if the wheels wobble. But every substitution carries a bill. It's paid later, in misfires, in breakdowns, and in the silence after a transmission dies mid-contact. So what actually keeps it running? Not efficiency, not transparency. A blend of coercion, improvisation, and the hope that tomorrow's batch will be better than today's. Fear can push output. It can't teach a chip to survive heat or a bearing to hold at speed. And when fear does the driving, competence sits in the back seat, watching the road crack. The fear dividend, coercion versus competence. While sanctions fed arbitrage, the real accelerator was fear. Carrots shrank, sticks grew, contracts slipped, pressure rose. When manpower ran short, the state reached into prisons and offered time off for time at the front. Locking units reappeared in new forms, detachments tasked less with fighting the enemy than with keeping their own lines from unraveling. Anti-retreat laws stiffened penalties. The message was clear: move forward or be crushed by the system behind you. Fear moves bodies. It doesn't teach skills. Commanders learned to manage up with optimism and down with pressure. Reports drifted from reality because reality killed careers. A battalion that barely held a tree line repulsed multiple assaults with minimal losses. A regiment with a third of its vehicles deadlined maintained high operational tempo. The words traveled farther than the problems they disguised. Leaders understood that accuracy carried risk, and risk was punished. So they shaved truth at the edges until it vanished. Innovation from below kept trying to surface. Junior officers hacked together drone teams, tuned jammers, and built trench cameras from consumer kits. An engineer in a signals unit repaired a drone jammer using scavenged boards and a code Tweaky found in a forum. It worked. Extended range, cleaner signal, better rejection of interference. He briefed his co, who congratulated him, then told him to stop. The device wasn't in the official inventory. Using it created liability. Weeks later, the engineer found himself sidelined to a store's audit. The jammer gathered dust. Rules had reasserted themselves. Coercion creates brittle operations. Units that rely on fear to keep formation can attack. They can't adapt fast. Risk-taking, the lifeblood of tactical success, requires trust up and down. Instead, leaders hoarded authority. Orders froze at headquarters until staff felt safe to sign. For platoons waiting for clearance on a flank move, that meant minutes lost and chances wasted. When orders finally arrived, they often reflected yesterday's ground truth dressed in today's confidence. Bureaucracies under fear chase metrics they can control. Casualty figures become classified, loss reports shrink, and drones count destroyed targets that post-battle recon can't confirm. Higher commands demand charts and heat maps. Junior leaders respond with stories their bosses can brief. Meanwhile, the real learning happens in encrypted chats. Don't trust that tire badge. Avoid that radio frequency near dawn. Set decoys on that ridge before cycling batteries. Knowledge spreads sideways, not up. Prison recruits changed unit dynamics. Some fought hard, motivated by survival and the promise of freedom. Others required handlers to prevent breakdowns or predation inside the ranks. Either way, cohesion took a hit. NCOs, already scarce, became bouncers and social workers. In attacks, the least trained took point under supervision, absorbing attrition. Short-term gains hid long-term decay. Units burned experienced cadres, resetting formations around rotating pools of coerced manpower. Blocking units radiated pressure. Their presence rewired decisions. A leader who might once pause to reorganize in defilade felt the shove of consequences behind him. That pushed attacks past the point of diminishing returns and made withdrawals harder to execute cleanly. It also bred quiet sabotage. A platoon lost comms to avoid a reckless push. A section misread a grid and arrived late, preserving lives at the cost of discipline. Fear didn't remove friction, it multiplied it. The performance gap widened in staff work. Logs tracked ammunition consumption to match allocations, not needs. Requests were shaped to avoid scrutiny, padded to anticipate theft, and timed to align with a patron's availability. A brigade might ask for 70% of what it required because it knew 30% would evaporate en route. When shells ran low, headquarters blamed excessive expenditure. Units shrugged and saved receipts that meant nothing. Meanwhile, propaganda substituted for morale. Medals flowed, ceremonies proliferated, and video edits framed hard fights as crisp wins. For soldiers, the dissonance cut deep. They respected leaders who protected them and fought smart, even if it meant disagreeing with a plan. They distrusted the ones who lived for cameras and shouted orders that maps didn't support. Fear kept the latter in place longer than competence would have. Strategically, fear slowed adaptation cycles. Ukraine iterated tactics in days. Russia often needed weeks because changes had to be blessed, funded, and deconflicted with interests. A new trench system design that saved lives in one sector took months to standardize. A drone munition that worked locally had to compete with a centrally contracted model that fed someone's margin. By the time approvals arrived, the enemy had moved on. Here's the quiet truth officers admitted to friends. The system could still mass fire and manpower, but at a growing inefficiency. Every offensive needed more shells to achieve the same effect because units were more cautious, targets were better protected, and loss tolerance masked planning laziness. Fear rewarded blunt force and punished finesse. It made commanders hedge, stack reserves, and overcompensate with artillery when better reconnaissance and trust in junior leaders would do. That trust broke on contact with clan politics. A division commander with the right patron demanded priority ammo. Others waited. A brigade flagged for favor received drones and yield support. Neighbors borrowed at night. Units learned to posture loyalty, posting videos, hosting visiting delegations, staging handovers, to climb resupply queues. Merit became a communications plan. The battlefield paid in missed timings and fragmented efforts. In the end, Coercion held the line barely. It could force an advance across a field. It couldn't teach a conscript to clear a room without losing his team, or a staff to synchronize fires with maneuver without burning precious shells. It kept the machine grinding by threatening the cogs, but a machine run on fear seizes under heat faster than one built on competence, and the temperature kept rising. What this means now? Corruption erodes combat power faster than attrition can replace it, because every shortcut today compounds into failures when bullets start flying. A military at war with itself can fight hard, even win ground, but it can't sustain high-intensity conflict without trust, honest reporting, and supply chains that deliver what labels promise. Fear can push bodies forward. It can't make radios connect or bearings hold. If you want more on how paper armies collapse under real pressure, watch the next documentary on procurement myths and battlefield math. Subscribe to the War Room for stories the press releases won't tell you, and hit the bell so you don't miss the next episode.